Just as I asked my fellow In Conversation gurus to join me on stage, Kiersten and Jim, before I introduce them, can I just echo on your behalf, Tilly, where's Tilly? Where are you? I can't see out there. Matilda, Harry, they're out the back. How fitting to be in a place, this place, and David, this place became Australia's home ground, cemented not only the John Aloisi goal, but the Kathy Freeman run, the 400 metres round the back. In some ways, it was the most similar moment of national reconciliation you could ever have achieved by a young Aboriginal woman in this house. Tilly, thank you for that warm welcome, that warm acknowledgement of country. I know it comes from the heart, and I know what a superstar you are for Western Sydney. So how appropriate to have another young Indigenous woman here in Australia's home ground welcoming us, the place where we welcome the world to the Olympic Games, where Western Sydney hosted the Sydney Olympic Games, and to have the welcome tonight. Tilly, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I got a couple, I'd say old stages, that's not Jim's old, Kiersten's not, but a couple of the most renowned bureaucrats of our state and country. Join me on stage for a little chat, people you know well. Kiersten Fishburn, the Secretary of the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. Jim Betts, the Secretary of the Federal Department of Infrastructure, Regional Development, and every other title I can fit on that. So we're going to have a chat. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
We're sitting here, Nick spoke before about how the kids are getting excited about infrastructure, and if they do, you two are responsible for it, so you're really driving it. Can I first say tonight, it's tough when you're a host on stage, when you've got to introduce the Premier later and you've got to interview Jim Betts beforehand, because he'll be in a tie when he gets here, and I'm surprised he's not in shorts and a T-shirt. So you've got to try and dress to somehow get the midpoint within, but Jim, this is like a tuxedo for you tonight, isn't it?
I've made a real effort for you, Chris.
Appreciate you dressed up for Boomtown. We sit here now, 2024, 50 years ago this year. Tell me if this scenario sounds similar. State governments struggling to meet basic utility rollout for a massive residential growth in the suburbs of Western Sydney, and a young dynamic Prime Minister called Gough Whitlam, a representative of Werriwa in Western Sydney, decided the federal government would come and lend a hand. Of all the glorious things Gough's known for, of equal pay for women and bringing 18-year-olds to vote and no-fault divorce and getting out of Vietnam, you name it, the romantic images of the Whitlam government, he got elected off bringing sewerage to the western suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne. I think he said he came, he saw, and when he left it fully flushed. Are we at the same tipping point? With all respect to all state governments for years, the challenge of managing the pricing of utility to keep up with growth is such. So between the two of you who sort of control the infrastructure departments at both ends of Canberra and Sydney, what's different about 50 years later? Why is it not just a delicious irony that we're back where we started? What role does Canberra play to help state governments manage that utility challenge of housing massive growth in our suburban areas?
So, Kiersten, do you think Canberra should provide more money to support infrastructure in Western Sydney?
I am legally obligated as a state public servant to say yes, I think Canberra should provide more money to the state.
There you go. Dorothy Dexter delivered. So the fact is that threshold has been crossed. The housing support program, which the federal government's currently funded to the tune of $1.5 billion, is about investment in water, in power, in sewerage, in roads. Kiersten's doing an amazing job with her department in terms of the rezonings and the development applications at the front end, but it's the feasibility at the back end and the enabling infrastructure at the back end which is risking off choking off the supply of housing. So the federal government absolutely has a role there which is acknowledged by that investment. And if you wanted to double down on that and to seek supplementary investment in that, that would be a great conversation for politicians to have with each other.
I get that. Kiersten, in that sense of a federal engagement, I don't think Albo's lying when he says there's not as much money as there used to be. We know that. If the problem facing governments, I'm not asking for a political question, but bureaucratic response, if the problem facing governments in New South Wales is the budgets are very tight and very thin, and and there's been a catch-up on pay that's needed for pay freezes and everything that's happened, if Canberra doesn't have the coin it used to have, I suppose the room looks around and says, why is there not more engagement of private investment in infrastructure? How do we, again, Nick said before, the kids are demanding PPPs in their Christmas stocking, but we have the world flush with global wealth funds. I've just come back from East London where Aussie Super's putting hundreds of millions of dollars into housing in East London, but not doing it here. How do we better engage that third part of the funding spectrum, federal government, state government, and the private sector to meet the obvious need we have?
So, look, I think there are real opportunities, not just in Western Sydney, but across New South Wales as well, to look at doing infrastructure more strategically and to engage with the private development community above and beyond developer contributions, much contested but also much needed to provide infrastructure that is required. Having those conversations in a way that is open to both parties rather than being combative, I think is something that I hope my department has demonstrated we're starting to lead on, and we want to continue in that way. If I can take it a step back as well, Chris, and you talked about, and look at, as the general manager who had, where we were in my area, I was, acutely aware of getting the toilets flushed. But what I actually think we're seeing now is a more nuanced agreement between the Commonwealth, state and local councils on broader aspirational pieces. And this is not to say, right, you need to be able to take a shower and go to the loo, right? That's really important. But you also need to be in agreement about what your economic aspirations are for that area, where you intend to invest, what are the really big pieces of kit that are really critical. And I mean, we talked about for many years the airport coming in, but if we just think about that as a, fly in, fly out play, we've lost a really good opportunity to look at economic catalysing in Western Sydney. So it's not just the infrastructure pieces. I think it's those joined up conversations about what the people of the West aspire to and deserve, and all three tiers of government being aligned in that discussion as well. That's the next iteration of matured out governance in relation to Western Sydney, or indeed into anywhere in Australia where you're having those conversations.
You mentioned the airport. If we've been through this amazing 10 years of infrastructure binge in Western Sydney, and it probably kicked off with the decision by the federal cabinet to locate the airport at Badgerys Creek. It certainly re-anchored Western Sydney south of the M4 from north. Back in the early iteration, planning was more about Northwest Growth Centre, et cetera, and that totally re-anchored. The Brisbane River flood and then the airport decision just took it south. And the growth that followed of metros, Western Sydney, Parkland, et cetera. If we had our druthers and amongst friends here in Chatham House Rules for 350 people, do we think we did the order right? There's a sense that it was a bit easier to go to the Western Parkland City greenfields and tougher to do the Central River City where density had been done badly, the punters weren't real keen, there's politics involved. In pure city shaping arms, and maybe calling your experience in other parts of the world too, Jim, as bold a call as it was, should we have probably staged outward more from Central River City and then to Western Parkland City? Or, and I'll take wherever I can get when I can get it, let's be honest, but in a pure perfect world with the benefit of hindsight, did we stage it properly?
So I think it highlights the way in which ideally the Commonwealth and state should work together, which is that the state controls the transport system, the state controls the statutory planning system. The Commonwealth should be there to provide supplementary funding and be guided in its investment priorities by the states, but nudge the states in positive and progressive directions by putting additional money on the table. So there was a huge breakthrough in terms of the Western Parkland City through the decision that Tony Abbott made in 2014 to invest in that. But the architecture of the three cities has stood the test of time, in my view. And I always feared that whilst the investment in the far west was very welcome, that it might come at the expense of more programmatic investment in the Central River City. And it will be a tragedy if Parramatta's capacity to operate as an activity centre, a centre of population, a centre of business, independent of public service relocation, was compromised through a lack of infrastructure. And it was spelled out in the 2018 Greater Sydney Region Plan that the critical enabling infrastructure was the radial transport network to support Parramatta. And I think there is significant unfinished business there. It's great to see the state government pressing on with Parramatta Light Rail. There's more to be done in that space. You can have both. They're not mutually exclusive. You take opportunities to secure the investment when the politics align. But it would be a shame if we went too far to the west and forgot the centre of gravity. And if you can get Parramatta to work, then you've gone further than any other city in Australia in terms of having a second CBD.
So I'm not going too far west. What if we go too far east? And I don't ask you to preempt the work of your guys at the High Speed Rail Authority, but I think Tim Parker will stand up at our conference tomorrow and say, Stage 1, Newcastle to Sydney CBD, and I'll stand up soon after and go, boo, because if it doesn't come, I'm a unity tick of the Lord Mayor of Parramatta here, I believe. If that train doesn't come to Parramatta or Olympic Park first, it'll never come to Parramatta or Olympic Park, frankly. So my concern is I'll do to speed rail what Peter Costello did in the 90s, but didn't go to Melbourne first. The Committee for Melbourne tried to kill it. Do we, and I won't throw this to you, I'll throw this to Kiersten because it's not fair to you because you're showing that that's still a report being done. Kiersten, in your city shaping, your experience at Liverpool Council, your experience at planning and now planning infrastructure, how central are those big licks of infrastructure, the big bits of kit, to your broader role of housing, infrastructure, community engagement, all the city shaping bits that flow from that?
Look, they're critical, and I think we've probably learnt a bit of a lesson as a city, which is actually how critical big transport infrastructure is as city shaping and placemaking, not just as travelling from one route to another, that we actually need to think about these things. And if I come back to, and it's a Eastern Sydney example, but the George Street Light Rail, I don't think about that as a transport project. I think about that as a placemaking, city shaping projects. And I think if we're able to start to recast a lot of our big transport or other type of infrastructure investments as placemaking, city shaping, housing enabling, that actually will lead to better planning outcomes. And if I think about the way, and we've always tried to bring together strategic planning and transport planning, but generally they run in parallel lines and occasionally they meet briefly and then they scale out again. If we can actually start to think about them as one and the same exercise, because while transport planning gets people from A to B, ultimately what it does is build cities. And that's a different way of thinking about the way we develop our infrastructure, and it may well change where you put your infrastructure. And I'm not going to get into Jim's high-speed rail argument. He and I can do that over a drink if we want to. But, that may change where you would put your stops, because you would think about this as a way to enable livability or economic development as much as you would enable someone travelling up a route.
That's completely right. And so I'd be amazed if you and Tim end up in an argument tomorrow. It'd be highly entertaining if you do, but it might be a bit premature.
Done. I'm a very polite advocate. Let's flick the switch to more personal stuff. You two are renowned in your profession as being two great leaders in the public sector. In other words, there's a bunch of them in the room, and I know Tim Reardon's back. He privatised himself for a while, but he's back as the Commissioner. We'll hear from Tim tomorrow. He's the lunch fare tomorrow. Don't miss it, gentlemen. Try the veal and listen to Tim Reardon. But we've heard a lot from governments generally about the need, and I don't mean it's not a knock on the big four, but that the reinvesting in in-house capacity. Albo started it probably as a policy. State governments are probably doing it out of reaction financially. What does really good governance look like? What does investment in great public policy inside government look like? And does that have to be the exclusion of civil society and the private sector, or can we get the model right where there is a actual exchange of ideas in the right probity, etc., to get a great outcome?
So there has to be the latter. So yeah, there's a bit of a moral panic correction around the lazy use of the big four in the past. And my view is unless you need surge capacity, unless you need highly specialist expertise, or unless you need something which is badged as very independent, then you shouldn't be going near the big four, and the big four are saying the same to me. So I think that's a manufactured culture war. The in-house capability of the public service is critical, but it takes two to tango. So if you have the elected officials saying, we're not interested in the ideas of the public service, you just blindly get on with implementing the genius ideas of politicians, then of course the public service is not going to engage its full creativity. There is a cult around frank and fearless advice, which I completely support, but we also need to establish our relevance as public servants. Politicians these days are capable of getting advice and insight from a whole range of different sources, and we are competing with other potential legitimate sources of advice. So we need to make ourselves relevant by understanding the problems which matter to politicians. They have to get re-elected, we don't. We have to understand the underlying problems, and if we give frank and fearless advice, it's about how we achieve their objectives in the most sensible, risk-free way. But we need not to adopt an excessively risk-averse culture. When I look at the outworkings of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission and the establishment of a National Anti-Corruption Commission at the national level, and if you've been through New South Wales and ICAC, that's kind of nothing, it's a walk in the park, then we need to make sure that we don't become so culturally risk-averse that the politicians stop listening to us. And the final thing I'd say about what the politicians could do to help us stop constantly reorganising the machinery of government. Please.
Here,
And
7 last
Dreaded
year.
MOG.
And stop, maybe, sounds a bit self-serving, but stop machine gunning secretaries as well. That would be really good. Because if you want...
Well, speaking of a secretary who's been machine gunned in a time.
I've been machine gunned twice.
Jim, Kiersten's had a go.
Yeah, well, I'll be sacked twice from the same job, Jim, so I'm going to, get one over you. Look, I agree with everything Jim says, and a couple of reflections from me to add to that as well. And it's actually a piece of advice, Jim, you won't remember, you gave it to me, but I bring it into my own staff all the time. Remember that politicians are there to govern, right? And if at a certain point you have not been able to come to agreement between two political parties, if you're calling when we had issues around how you would manage koalas, right? Then at a certain point, you need to give your advice, you need to step back and let your, political, master or mistress take that into the cabinet room and deal with it there. And it's not our job as public servants to actually be resolving what ultimately has to be a political decision. And I thought that was really excellent advice. And if I watch some of the challenges in the public sector, and I'll say across the 2 tiers of government I'm experienced with, and I can't speak for the Commonwealth, there has been a tendency to try and solve rather than to say at a certain point this is a political decision. And that's something I think is really important. The other thing I think as well is pride in public service. And, it's not, people don't think it's a sexy career to go into, but, if we want to have the next generation of career public servants, they need to appreciate that it is a wonderful job. And, I've been talking to a lot of my staff recently, and I say to them that, I'm the second generation secretary in my family. My mum was a secretary as well, and we're the only other woman and daughter I think ever to have done that, mum and daughter. And my mum always used to say to me, to be a servant of the public is the most honourable profession that there is. And I think we've lost that sense. And, I'm trying to bring it back with my staff, because public servants that feel proud and committed will be the best public servants for the rest of the country and the rest of the state.
Well, Jim, absolutely. Jim knows I got in a bit of trouble for once writing a letter to a newspaper saying that we should stop attacking public servants like Jim and have a bit of civility in public, professionalism and civility in public life. They didn't listen, and they're still doing it. Yeah, that went well. Just finalising for both of you, the person behind the nameplate, not just the Gormless public servants at the top of a big bureaucratic machine. Kiersten, you've had a fairly high-profile battle with health while you've come through it and become a member of the Troika. You're now in the Troika. That's,
Yes.
and I'm not allowed to call it Part 3A. I know it's not Part 3A, but it's something that looked a little bit like it, but with a Troika involved as well to give more direct...
I normally go for the laugh, but can I please say this is not Part 3A. I'm just putting it out there very seriously. This is an attempt to provide optionality in the planning system so we can get things approved faster. And I just want to be very careful about that, because it's really important that we tackle housing supply and diversity, and, having it slammed as Part 3A is not a useful exercise.
And the word Troika sounds...
I'll take the
let the joke
Troika.
go.
I don't care. Troika, fine. I've been called worse things, but
Troika
but
sounds
it's not
like one
Part
of the
3A.
bands Jim used to follow in Britpop in the UK.
Oh, no, Jim, you don't like Britpop.
Sorry, take for my sins, take Britpop away from his...
Mike Murdoch never had to put up with this kind of...
Jim, for you, you are not just standard public servant. You have somehow generated a lot more media attention than your average public servant managed to get. You seem to revel in it a lot more than most of them get as well. But how do you keep the focus and keep going when you're a front page story at a Daily Telegraph in the morning or a Sky News at night? How do you just plough on through it? And do your ministers sometimes get a little nervous about their sexy bureaucrat?
I wouldn't think they recognise that description of me. No, I haven't had any difficult conversations with any ministers about any of that. So my view is that my job is to do my job and to get on cracking on with things and to implement, get stuff done. and that's absolutely critical, deliver on the government's priorities. But when I think about diversity and inclusion, which is the thing that I've been attacked for from the far right of politics, I kind of think that remaining silent on justice for Indigenous people or for the LGBTIQA plus community, that is taking a position. And I'm not prepared to take a position which is silent on that stuff. You can't be expected as a leader in contemporary Australia not to operate in a way which fosters diversity and inclusion within your organisation. And if you get criticised for doing that, for having some kind of woke agenda, the woke agenda to me is old-fashioned values of politeness, civility and respect extended to people that it hasn't been traditionally extended to. And that is it's incumbent on all leaders to do that. And if I get attacked by people I don't respect, A, I don't care, and B, maybe I'm drawing fire from the real people they're attacking, who are the marginalised, the disadvantaged people that they're too gutless to actually attack themselves.
Well, I think absolutely. In closing, one of those ministers you've served, Rob Stokes, a friend of this organisation as well, managed to turn up to the parliamentary inquiry 2 weeks ago with the T-shirt wearing
So proud.
"Not my problem," which went down very well.
It's my legacy.
With some of his former parliamentary colleagues who were, but it took the great poet of our time, Mark Latham, to lead in and say, "You're just cranky because he's the only ex-politician who can still wear a T-shirt." So even Mark could crack the funny at that point. He tamed the beast. In closing, ladies and gentlemen, Adam and I and the team spend all day having to engage fairly frankly with government. Adam engaged fairly frankly with the Premier this week over Bondi in defence of keeping it open, and I'm sure it wasn't nice on the front page. I'm sure the Premier rang the Minister rang the Secretary, but we have a job to do, they've got a job to do, but in these two people, and with most of the other people in the room from the public sector, the honour of public service drives them strongly, probity, but also partnership. And that's a fine line. That's a difficult line to tread at all times, because we all make it difficult for them. So we can all tut about it. I wish they were more engaging, and then we're the first ones to run to clickbait media about some bureaucrat on the take. It's a kind of crazy arms race we all do. But on our behalf, the Secretaries of Infrastructure at national and state level are two people whom we've had massive respect and an awful lot of engagement, and of whom you can be very, very thankful and proud of. So please thank Kiersten, Fishburn and Jim Betts. Thanks, mate. Thanks, mate. Appreciate it.